Hello, Bio 20, Mr. Walker here. This lesson is going to be on the human respiratory system, and this first slide is showing us some of the various larger macroscopic structures for the most part associated with the respiratory system. So not labeled on here, we do have the nose or the nasal cavity, we do have the mouth or the oral cavity, and of course it's through either one of those routes that we can take the air into and air out of our body. At the back of the mouth, a region that is called the pharynx, and from the pharynx, that air is then going to pass into a region called the trachea, which is just the windpipe, goes past the larynx, which is called which is your voice box, and then the trachea, the single tube going down through your neck and into your chest area, is going to branch into two different bronchi, bronchial tubes that has labeled here, one going toward each one of your lungs. The lung on the left side of your body is made up of two regions referred to as lobes. The one on the right-hand side is made up of three different lobes. And of course, keep in mind that it is slightly on the left-hand side of the body where you also have your heart that's sitting somewhere around in this region here. What it also shows in the box is that if we do zoom in on one of the lungs, and now we can see some of the more microscopic structures. So the smallest of the branching tubes are called the bronchioles, and where they do terminate are on some blind-ended sacs, which are called alveoli. So in your lungs, in each one of your lungs, there is somewhere on the order of about 1 million of these alveoli. And the function of having many of these, as opposed to just two large air-filled sacs, one for each one of your lungs, is, as we've seen before, increasing surface area. And that is going to make a process more efficient, which in this case is going to be the process of gas exchange. So what we'll see is going to be taking place in the alveoli is air that you breathe in, which is higher in oxygen than the amount of oxygen that you have in your blood in your body. That oxygen is going to diffuse out of your alveoli and eventually into your blood. And in your blood, you're going to have a higher concentration of the waste that is produced by your cells, carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide is going to diffuse in the opposite direction. So this is, as we'll see, based on the process of diffusion. So in order for diffusion to really be efficient, we have to have a few different criteria that are met. The first one I mentioned already, a very large surface area. Diffusion is only efficient over very short distances. So very short distance between the blood vessels, the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, and the alveoli. And the other one is a large concentration gradient. The larger the concentration difference between the oxygen in the alveoli and the oxygen in the blood, the greater the amount of that diffusion is going to be. So again, these are the three sort of criteria or conditions that are necessary to maximize this process of gas exchange that is taking place at the interface between the alveoli and the lining of the smallest blood vessels going through your lungs, which are the capillaries. This slide here is going to take us through what is referred to as the mechanics of breathing. So when we talk about breathing, it is really just the process of getting air from outside of your body into your lungs and from your lungs to the outside of your body. Really has nothing to do with the exchange that I was just talking about. So how this does happen is by using several different muscles and what is referred to as negative pressure. So negative pressure is going to result in air not being pushed into the lungs, but being drawn into the lungs. This muscle right here, the diaphragm, is your primary respiratory muscle. There are other muscles that might be involved in breathing as well, especially during heavy exertion, like when you're exercising. So that includes muscles that you do find in between your ribs called the intercostal muscles that we would find in these ones here, and even possibly some of the muscles that are around your neck area and around your clavicle, your collarbone. So the picture on the left-hand side, it is showing the process of inhalation or breathing in. So in this case, what you do want to do is draw the air into your lungs. So what is going to happen is that diaphragm muscle, it is going to contract. Normally the diaphragm is described as a dome-shaped muscle, as I'm trying to draw here in the blue. And when the diaphragm contracts, what is going to happen is it's going to flatten out. So as it does flatten out, the key thing that's going to result from this is it's going to increase the area inside the thoracic cavity. So when we do have, again, the contraction of the diaphragm, what that leads directly to is an increase in thoracic volume. When we have an increase in thoracic volume, if you're increasing the volume of an area and you have the same number of air molecules, what that means is that now they're under lower pressure. They're more spread apart, they're under lower pressure. So contraction of the diaphragm increases the thoracic volume, and that then leads to a decrease in thoracic pressure. Now what we have is lower pressure inside of the thoracic cavity, inside of the lungs, than the pressure that we do have outside of the body. So when that happens, that's going to result in air being drawn in. Air going in, and that of course is the process of inhalation. So again, going back up to the top here, how do we get that air that's going in? We have the contraction of the diaphragm. That increases the volume inside of the thoracic cavity in the lungs. That's going to drop the pressure, and that's going to draw the air in. Again, the air is not being pushed in, the air is being pulled in. What happens during exhalation or breathing out is we just reverse everything. So now instead of the diaphragm contracting, the diaphragm is going to relax. What is that going to do? Well, it's going to push up, and that is now going to decrease the thoracic volume. Decrease the thoracic volume, it's now going to be compressing whatever gases there are inside of the lungs. So that's going to result in an increase in thoracic pressure. And now what you have is a higher pressure inside of the lungs than what you have outside of the body. So in this case, we're going to have the air that's now going to be forced out, and that is the process of exhalation. So how is it that when the diaphragm contracts, when we do have an expansion of the rib cage of the thoracic cavity, that's also going to result in an expansion of the lungs? Well, if we take a look at some of the finer structure in and around the lungs, so we can see the two different lungs that we have on either side here in red, and again, the heart that we have right sort of sandwiched. For the most part, it's right in the middle, right behind your sternum, but it is slightly over to the left-hand side, and that is why the left lung that we see over here is in fact slightly smaller than the right lung. So those are what we're seeing in red. So the rib cage we would find all around the outside here. So rib cage we would find right around here, the bones and the muscles. But then we have a couple of really important membranes. These skin-like membranes, they are called the pleura. One is called the parietal pleura and the other one the visceral. So the picture that we see at the top, right on the outside of the lungs, and what they're showing here using the blue line, that is going to be the visceral pleura. So that's what we see right here. Notice how it goes all around the lung here. The inside, the outside adjacent to the rib cage, and also down at the bottom where we have the diaphragm. Of course, the diaphragm would be sitting down in this area here. That's the diaphragm. What we also have then is this other thin skin-like membrane, and that is the parietal pleura. And that's the one right here that I'm showing in red. So these two membranes, they sit really adjacent to each other. In between them is what is called the interpleural space. So even though it is called the interpleural space, most of the time, in fact, it's not a space. There is no space there, and there is a fluid, and this fluid in between the two of them really kind of ensures that these two membranes, the two different pleura, they are kind of stuck together. So what that means is that when you do breathe in, and the rib cage goes out, the rib cage goes up, the diaphragm goes down. What that's going to do is pull on the parietal pleura, which in turn is going to pull on the visceral pleura, which is attached to the two lungs. So it's going to pull the lungs out, and that's what's going to allow for the expansion of the lungs, the expansion of the thoracic volume, and the volume inside of the lungs as well. So again, keep in mind that the air is not pushed in, the air is drawn in. The air is really drawn in due to the negative pressure that is created inside of the lungs when you do have the contraction of the diaphragm and the increase in thoracic and lung volume. What happens when someone has a collapsed lung? Well, that space that shouldn't really be a space, all of a sudden it becomes a space. So the two different pleura again, the parietal, the visceral, they should be adjacent to each other. So that is exactly what we do see on the left lung. Again, this is the left lung that we see here. So if I use this one here to represent the one that's adjacent to the lungs, the visceral pleura, and the other one on the inside of the rib cage. Here they're adjacent to each other with the left lung, but when we take a look at the right lung, we can see that, well, all of a sudden that is not the case. So the visceral pleura has pulled away from the parietal, and now what we do have is a space in between the two of them. So what this means is that now when we do have the diaphragm that contracts, the diaphragm that pulls down, it's going to expand the left lung, but it's not going to allow for the expansion of the right lung because these two pleura are no longer adjacent to each other. So again, that is more or less what is going on if someone does have a collapsed lung. So the important details in terms of what is really going on in the lungs is gas exchange. So of course we do know that your cells need oxygen for cellular respiration, and your cells are producing carbon dioxide as a waste. So cellular respiration, what is taking place in each one of your cells is oxygen, which you get through your respiratory system that we're talking about. The fuel, the primary fuel that we talk about is glucose, and of course that is going to be absorbed through your digestive system inside of your cells through cellular respiration and the process that they use in order to make the usable form of energy, ATP. The cells are going to be producing carbon dioxide, and they're going to be producing water. So your cells need this oxygen, otherwise they can't burn the fuel. And in the process, they're going to produce this waste. So the respiratory system is really doing two different things. It's going to get that oxygen to your cells to use for cellular respiration, and it's also going to get rid of the waste carbon dioxide that is produced by your cells, and that is why your lungs are also considered to be an excretory organ. They are getting rid of a waste, and the waste in this case is the carbon dioxide. So a nice simplified diagram here in terms of what is going on in the lungs with gas exchange. Gas exchange is only going to be taking place with the smallest of all blood vessels, and those are the capillaries. So where it's showing here in blue and in red, these are the capillaries. The smallest of the blood vessels, thinnest of the blood vessels, and it's only here where we can have things like oxygen and carbon dioxide that can move from one side of these blood vessels, the lining of the blood vessels, the endothelial lining, to the other side. So if we start at the upper left hand, what we have here is the blood that's coming in. Again, we use the blue to represent blood that is low in oxygen or deoxygenated blood. I'll just put here low in O2. So what's the point of this blood going to the lungs? Well, for one thing, to pick up oxygen. So it's low in oxygen, it's high in carbon dioxide. You need to get rid of that carbon dioxide, you need to pick up the oxygen. So as this blood flows by the alveoli, there's going to be a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood than what there is in the lungs. So again, it's based on diffusion that we're going to have the carbon dioxide and the oxygen moving in one direction or the other. So in the case of carbon dioxide, the concentration gradient is going to result in it moving from the blood, out of the blood, crossing the lining of the blood vessels, crossing the lining of the alveoli, and eventually into these tiniest of the air sacs, the alveoli. In the case of the oxygen, exactly the opposite. So we can see sort of the halfway or dividing point here where we are getting rid of the carbon dioxide and now picking up the oxygen. So we use the red color to represent oxygenated blood or blood that is high in O2. So why is it now high in O2? Well, it just came from the alveoli, and now we can get that blood out of the lungs and deliver it to all of the cells in your body so they can use it for the process of cellular respiration. As with carbon dioxide, the reason why this oxygen is moving out of the lungs and into the blood is because of diffusion. There is a higher concentration of it in the alveoli than there is in the blood, so that is going to be the driving force moving that oxygen out of the lungs, out of the alveoli, and into the capillaries. This picture here is showing us more detailed events in terms of the oxygen and carbon dioxide and the exchange that is taking place. So we do have labeled here the alveoli at the left-hand side. We have the lining of the blood vessel that we see right here. This is the lining of the blood vessel. Again, I've called that the endothelial lining. This is the lining of the alveoli that we have here. And once we cross over the endothelial lining of the blood vessels, then we are now into the blood. So the important parts of the blood that we're concerned about here, the liquidy fluidy portion of the blood, which is the blood plasma, and also a big red representation of a red blood cell. So we'll see what the plasma function is and the red blood cell function is in terms of transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if we take a look at the oxygen, first of all, again, we have more of the oxygen that is present inside of the alveoli than what you have in your body, than what you have in your blood. So this oxygen is now going to move from where there is more to where there is less. That is the driving force. The higher the concentration gradient, the higher the difference in concentration between the alveoli and the blood, the more diffusion is going to take place. Again, in order for diffusion to be efficient, we also want to make sure that this distance here is very, very small. And we also want to ensure that what we have is a very high surface area. So we have a high surface area, in fact, in two different ways here. The millions of alveoli create a very large surface area. And these blood vessels that we're talking about here, again, these are the capillaries. These are the smallest of the blood vessels, and they as well have an extremely large surface area. So what happens when that oxygen is diffusing out of the lungs, out of the alveoli, and into the blood? Some of the oxygen can actually dissolve right in the plasma. Plasma is not that great at dissolving and transporting the oxygen, so this isn't going to be the major mechanism by which oxygen is transported in the blood, but it is one way that it can be transported. The major one, though, is by taking that oxygen and getting it into the red blood cells. So we can see here that once inside of the red blood cells, this right here, HB, is the abbreviation for hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that is responsible for grabbing onto, holding onto, and transporting oxygen to your cells that will eventually use it for cellular respiration. So when we do take that oxygen, combine it with HB hemoglobin, then we form right here what is called oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin that has oxygen attached to it. So now that can be transported to your cells, and we'll see what happens at the cellular level in terms of that oxyhemoglobin. But what about the carbon dioxide that's been coming from your tissues? So carbon dioxide can be transported in the blood in 3 different ways. Like the oxygen, it can dissolve in the plasma, and in fact, carbon dioxide does dissolve a little bit better in the plasma than oxygen does. Carbon dioxide can also be transported by hemoglobin. So once at the tissue level, when hemoglobin gives up its oxygen, the carbon dioxide can now combine with the hemoglobin, and it can form this one here, which is called carboxyhemoglobin. Here it has it as carbaminohemoglobin or carboxyhemoglobin, hemoglobin that now has carbon dioxide attached to it. That is the second way that carbon dioxide can be transported in the blood, but the major one is taking carbon dioxide in the red blood cells, reacting it with water and forming this one right here, which is carbonic acid. That carbonic acid is then going to dissociate into protons and bicarbonate ion. This will be grabbed by hemoglobin as well, so it doesn't change the pH of the blood that much. And this is the major mechanism by which carbon dioxide is going to be transported in your blood and throughout your body, going from your cells and tissues and delivering it to the lungs. So again, in the case of the oxygen, 2 different ways that it can be transported. This is one, kind of minor, dissolved in the plasma. This is the major one here, combining with hemoglobin in the form of oxyhemoglobin. In the case of carbon dioxide, 3 different ways it can be transported. 1, dissolved in the plasma. 2, combining with hemoglobin. And 3, forming carbonic acid, and eventually the bicarbonate ions. So all of this is gas exchange that is taking place at the interface between the lungs, the alveoli, and the blood, and this is referred to as external respiration. So some terms to keep straight here. Cellular respiration is what is taking place in the cells. Oxygen and glucose being used, carbon dioxide and water being produced. External respiration is referring specifically to the exchange of gases that are taking place in the lungs. Breathing, as we already saw, is simply taking the air into and out of the lungs. The other one, the last one here, this one here is internal respiration. Internal respiration is what is taking place at the tissue or cellular level. And this is where you're taking that oxygen that was picked up in the lungs and delivering it to these cells. And you're taking the carbon dioxide that's being produced by these cells and getting it into the blood so you can transport it to the lungs. So really what we just saw on the previous slide is reversed here. So now we have your cells that are producing carbon dioxide. There's more carbon dioxide in the cells than there is in the blood. So that carbon dioxide is now going to move into the blood. What does it do in the blood? Well, as we just saw, it's going to combine with the hemoglobin to form this here. That's one of the ways that we can transport that carbon dioxide. We can have the carbon dioxide dissolving in the plasma. We can have the carbon dioxide, and again, if you take a look at the size of the arrow here, what it's showing is that this is how most of the carbon dioxide is transported, reacting with water, carbonic acid, carbonic ions. Again, to prevent any huge changes in pH, the protons combine with hemoglobin, and that is how most of this bicarbonate is going to be, or most of the carbon dioxide is going to be transported. And we can see here as well that the bicarbonate is just going to diffuse into the plasma. And then when it gets into the lungs, it's going to be converted back into the carbonic acid, back into the carbon dioxide, and then it can diffuse into the lungs. What about the oxygen? Again, a little bit, taking a look at the arrow here, a little bit does dissolve in the plasma, but the vast majority of the hemoglobin is transported in the blood, combining with hemoglobin in the form of the oxyhemoglobin. When it gets to your cells that need the oxygen, again, much higher concentration in the blood than in the cells that are using the oxygen. So that oxygen is going to be released from the diffuse the oxygen will be released from the hemoglobin, diffuse out of the red blood cells and out of the blood and eventually into the cells and tissues that can then use it for cellular respiration. Finally here, how do you regulate what is going on in terms of breathing? So when to breathe more deeply, when to breathe more rapidly. There are two major breathing control centers in your body. Both of them are located in what is called the brain stem, the lower portion of your brain. Major one here is called the medulla oblongata, and the other one is referred to as the pons. Both of them are related to breathing. They are both controlling different aspects of breathing, the rhythm versus the tempo of the breathing. But in order for them to tell the diaphragm really what to do in terms of whether to contract with more force or contract more frequently, then we do have to have some information going to the medulla oblongata and the pons. So there are some receptors right in the medulla oblongata itself. And these receptors in the medulla oblongata, they're going to be measuring two major things. They're going to be measuring carbon dioxide, and they're going to be measuring these ones here, which are the protons. There are some other areas that also do some kind of detecting as well. So the carotid arteries carrying blood up to your brain, the aorta, you'll also have what are called receptors there. And there might be receptors there also for carbon dioxide, for protons, but there are also receptors for oxygen. So all of these are going to take that information about the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the blood, about the protons in the blood, send that information to the breathing control centers, and then a determination has to be made. Do we need to get more oxygen into the body? Do you need to get rid of more carbon dioxide? And that sort of thing would then, in turn, increase the contraction of the diaphragm and increase the breathing rate. Now, the major factor, in fact, that does control breathing is this one here, because the number of protons does have an influence on pH. And pH is something that needs to remain under very, very fine control in your body. So very, very slight changes in pH are going to change the breathing rate. Now, we did already see that as carbon dioxide is produced, carbon dioxide is converted into or carried in the form of carbonic acid, which again is eventually converted into bicarbonate, and in turn, this is produced. So the more carbon dioxide in your body, the more protons, that will result in a decrease in pH, and that's the sort of thing that will increase the contraction of the diaphragm fairly quickly in order for you to get rid of that carbon dioxide and bring the pH back up again to more neutral values.